Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple bins that need to be fed. The ones I've got in my sights for today are this one up here. This is the older of my two African nightcrawler bins. It's actually a bag. It's a bag within a bin. The whole idea, I guess, is that the bag provides a little bit more airflow, give the worms a more oxygen-rich environment to be in. The other bin is down here, which is once again a bin within a bin. Instead of a bag within a bin, this is a bin within a bin. This is only because both bins have a bunch of holes punched in them. And I figured between the two bins, with the holes not matching up, I don't have a bunch of holes that are going to, result in material dropping out the bottom. It's been 8 days since these two African nightcrawler systems were fed, and they're due for another feeding today. There were a little bit of moisture concerns last week, and in one of the containers here, I had actually omitted the covering of plastic that had been up in there up until 8 days ago, hoping that some of the moisture in there would evaporate out. On this one, I left the plastic covering, but I did add a fair bit of dry paper within the bin as bedding. And then there was also a fresh sheet of newspaper added, which I thought might also help soak up a little bit of moisture. So we're going to give these guys a little bit of food today and see how the moisture situation is progressing, and, if need be, deal with any sort of issues that might crop up. So let's get these little guys up onto the bench and start our feeding. Okay, so we're going to do the older bin first here. With only this paper on top, I would have to imagine that things on the top surface are going to be a little bit more arid than usual. I guess one thing I'm noticing here is right between these two sheets of paper, we seem to have attracted some flying insects. I don't know. I'm not sure why. I see a number of them here and there. Quite a few of them, actually. I don't know. It's strange. Always a new thing going on. I've taken the option of not zipping up the container lid, because the container lid could just be zipped shut. But I've often found that it didn't seem to help a lot, at least on my Vermibag Mini. Even when I zip up, it doesn't seem like it keeps the flying insects out, so I didn't feel like I would bother doing it on this bin. I could see a lot of flying insects crawling around right here on the top surface of the bin too. Wow. It's pretty surprising. I definitely don't like that. A lot of times when we do have plastic covering the system, that piece of newspaper that was out here on the top is receiving a lot of moisture that's collecting on the plastic and dropping back down onto the paper, and it attracts a lot of worms hanging out there. A lot of worms are attracted to the top surface of the bin, the material out here on the top, because it's all nice and damp. It's a much different thing here after 8 days of there being no plastic covering this container. And if it feels like down within the bin, if the moisture situation has stabilized, I might go right back to putting the plastic coverings back on this thing, because number one, I do see a fair bit of drying happening here. The material right on the top surface is fairly dry now. And I don't like the fact that there's flying insects gathering here. So I'm hoping that maybe restoring the coverings will be one way to potentially limit the number of flying insects that make their way down into this container. A lot of times I'll start by examining the bin right down the middle. I figured this time we're just going to check out on the edges and see how things look. There's not a lot of material in this bin yet, so it's easy enough just to scoop right down low and bring the bottom right up to the top so we could see how things are looking. There's definitely a good amount of moisture down in here still. But I think that I think that both of the systems that we're going to be tending to today are new enough that even if I allow for a little bit of excess moisture to occur at this stage, we'll have plenty of time to remedy it and recover from it. So even if we find things to be a little bit more damp in here than we would want them to be today, I believe I'm definitely going to be returning the plastic coverings to this. I think mainly in the hopes that maybe it'll just prevent the flying insects from hanging out in here the way I'm seeing. I can see a good number of worms hanging out in the material over on the edge. Down here in the middle is where we fed last time, but you know what? I like this idea of taking all this dry material and kind of upturning it. And at the same time also examining how things are down low. So let's just do another quick examination of this far edge of the container. Still a good number of bedding bits, cardboard mainly, maybe pieces of paper. I usually build my bins with a good amount of newspaper and cardboard and different types of carbon-rich materials. So it's not surprising to see a good amount of that stuff scattered throughout the material. Once the bin starts to get older and older, you know, a lot of that will eventually get broken down. And we actually added a little bit more paper last week too. We added some shredded paper as part of our feeding, kind of like a bedding below the food that we added. So why don't we start making our way down the middle to see how the feeding from last week is progressing. I'm trying to remember what it is that they received. Yeah, I remember now. It was the stems of beets, and it was the leaves of leeks, kind of like an onion. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Is the green is the leeks. And I think I even smell a slight scent of onion in here. I don't think I see any traces of the stems of the beets. Those kind of have like a red color to them. I am seeing some stems, but I believe that the stems that I'm seeing down here are actually a little bit older from feedings in the past. I think they were banana stems that I saw a couple of. Like this one right here, which will normally take a little bit of time to break down, sometimes about a month or so, which is what I've been noticing lately. So yeah, I think things look okay in here, okay enough to restore the plastic coverings. I'm just kind of slowing down the pace a little bit now because I did feel like I was noticing a couple of cocoons here and there. I could see one out here on the surface. I saw a couple more. I think I see one right here, pretty dark in color actually. The darker these cocoons get in color, the closer they are to actually hatching. They're fairly light in color when they're originally deposited by the worm in the bedding. They'll get darker and darker over time as the time nears for them to emerge out of their little cocoons. So I think what we're going to do here today is very similar to what we did last week. We're going to grab some paper and scatter it down here into the middle as a sort of a fresh layer of bedding to place under the food they're receiving. This looks like newspaper. I'm trying to see if I could find any traces of the paper that was added here last week. I believe it would be this stuff right here. Kind of like a paper bag, brown paper bag sort of a material that I had run through my shredder, so I've got a good amount of it. Well, I had a good amount of it. I've been using it up in my feedings lately. But we're going to place some of that down here on the bottom. And by placing it in dry like this, I believe it's going to help a little bit with maybe absorbing a little bit of the moisture within the bin. At least I hope so. And I think once we restore those newspaper coverings that were across the top, which are also fairly dry, we're going to also gain the benefit of those sucking up some of the moisture in the bin too. And then we're going to restore plastic coverings here. The feeding today is a variety of different things that I'm assuming they're going to really enjoy, because like the cucumbers are almost purely water. This is potato, kind of chunked together, frozen together, but it'll thaw, and as it thaws, I'm assuming it'll emit a little bit of moisture. And the other thing you're seeing in here is cauliflower. This stuff was, I think with the exception of the cucumber, which is something I found in the drawer in the refrigerator here at home, I think the cauliflower and the potato were compliments of my mom. Last time I went to her house, she's always providing me with stuff to give to the wormies. And I believe that the majority of what they're getting here today is compliments of her. And I've also got some used coffee we're going to add. But you know what? Let's sprinkle on a little bit of grit. I've got my collection of grit here, which is almost empty. So I figured between these two African nightcrawler bins that I'm going to be feeding today, I would just tap out the remainder of what I have here. So I'll try to save a little bit for the other bin that we're going to feed momentarily. And then we'll place in half of the coffee I bought down here for these little guys. That looks like a pretty nice feeding right there. I believe it is just deep enough that I should be able to submerge it by bringing some of this material from the sides back over to cover up with. You can also see that I'm sort of bringing some of the food from previous feedings to the surface. Here's another banana peel. I guess that's one of the side effects of stirring things around like this, is that there's not a lot of accounting for where things are. So we're finding all kinds of bits and pieces of things right there on the surface. And if we allow things on the surface to get really dry the way we just did over the past 8 days, those things on the surface don't really get any attention. So I think by restoring the coverings to this container, the plastic coverings specifically, we're going to restore that nice damp, moist condition to the top surface, as well as to the newspaper coverings, so that all that area suddenly will be fair game for the worms to travel throughout. By making things kind of dry on the top surface, I think it all just makes those dry areas kind of out of bounds for the worms. They will just not be able to do very well in such dry conditions, and then they'll, eventually work their way back down into the more moist bedding. So I think by covering things up with plastic, we keep everything in the bin nice and cozy for them. So right now, I guess I'm treating this large piece of newspaper in the middle as sort of my feeding zone indicator, if you will. Kind of a tradition in my wormery. Even though I almost always feed down the middle, I like to try to indicate for myself where that feeding had occurred most recently. Didn't we use the colorful side last time? Yeah. So we'll keep the colorful sides on top. A little splash of color to see when we get in here. So these pieces of paper coming in here dry will probably help a little bit, but we're going to also place a piece of plastic across the top too. These fairly large plastic bags that I get from our local big box store here in this area always seem to work really nicely for covering things up in the bins. I'm able to reach all the way out to the far reaches of the container, pretty much pressing the bag right up against the sides of the container here, I guess with the kind of wrinkly edges of the bag. I can even do a pretty good job protecting the top surface of the bin and its material from being exposed to the air, and hopefully at least minimizing the number of little flying insects that are going to continue making their home in here. So I can still see them here and there. My hope is that by stirring everything up, I've kind of scared them away up into the air, and hopefully they won't return. So I guess we'll have to see. I sure hope they don't return. All right, let's get the other African nightcrawler container out here. Okay, now here in this 45-day-old African nightcrawler container, we do have a plastic covering that's been on here the whole while. The other bin we just fed, the bag, 101 days of age at this point. This one's 45 days of age. And here, I've actually combined the cardboard covering and the plastic to make the manipulation of the plastic a little bit easier. Let's get this little guy off of here. That should make the removal of this piece of paper pretty easy. I believe this piece of paper was placed on here fresh. I think it was a brand new piece of paper. But it's completely soaked at this point. Totally drenched. Which makes complete sense. I think besides that piece of dry paper being placed on here, there was a bit of dry paper, just like we put into the bin we just fed. Some of that shredded brown paper bag type material placed in here in the hopes that that too would absorb some of the moisture in the bin. I see a flying insect right there, but that's the only one. So I don't know if maybe it just landed on the tripod and came back down here. Maybe this bin doesn't have that same sort of flying insect situation going on in here like the bag did. My hope is that by putting plastic over that bag, we're gonna see the flying insect situation stop. Definitely damp. A lot of moisture here in this bin. But luckily no flying insects. Pretty good sized worm population in here too so far from what I could see. I guess for 45 days old, what makes it 6.5 weeks old at this point. Still a relatively young bin. Month and a half old. So there's all kinds of stuff all out here on the edges. A lot of leafy material, a lot of sticks and stems, a lot of cardboard. As the bin gets older, it'll start to look a little more mature. It'll look more like just a bin full of worm castings, as opposed to a bin full of, you know, bedding type materials. Here too we could see, you know, a lot of cardboard, paper, stuff like that. A lot of times for me, just the stems of the leaves are also an indicator of how mature a bin is. If I see a lot of this stuff, I can tell right away. It's a fairly young bin. In my newer and younger bins, I do use a lot of leafy material, a lot of crushed leaves and stuff, which brings with it all the stems of those leaves. But as bins start to get older, I try to use less of that type of bedding material, fewer leaves and maybe more paper instead as bedding, in the hopes that that material will break down a little bit more readily than the leaves, mainly because of the sticks and stems of the leaves. But you could tell right away from the nice damp conditions, the worms are, you know, pretty content just to be roaming all over the place in the bin, even right up on top of the paper. Even though we only saw one up there, that in itself is an indication of the fact that even up on top of that piece of paper is a comfortable place for the worms to be. So we're kind of breaking my normal pattern here where I just dive right down into the feeding area to see how things are progressing. We're doing the same thing here, sort of examining the outskirts of the bin first, see how things look on the far edges, and then we'll make our way into the last feeding zone to see how things are progressing. This side of the bin just doesn't seem quite as damp as the other side seemed. But still plenty moist, that's for sure. I did notice on my glove after we finished feeding the last bin, there was not a lot of stuff sticking to the glove, but here it's a somewhat different situation. A lot more moisture usually translates into a lot more stuff sticking to my glove. But I wouldn't say that, you know, the moisture level is too bad. All right, we're starting to make our way into the middle now. Here I think we're seeing more signs of this paper, shredded paper that had been placed in here as bedding. Oh yeah, quite a bit of it down here. But the feeding that this bin received would have been pretty much the same as the other bin. It would have been some of those green leaves of the leeks and onions, which I see a little sign of here. I could smell it a little bit too. But not too bad. It seems like they really did enjoy the leaves of the beets though. And it's funny, it was something I didn't even know. I brought it up in the last video. I questioned why certain vegetables from the vegetable market include all the leafy materials and the stems, like you see on carrots sometimes, and I guess with beets and other things as well. And somebody said in the comments that the reason you see that is because those parts of the vegetable are also considered edible. Maybe make a salad out of it or whatever. I mean, in my experience, that stuff was typically just discarded. Some people make use of all those stems and leaves, make salads out of it, whatever. Pesto, I think, was another example of what some of the leaves, maybe off of carrots, could be used for. So I never realized that. Makes complete sense as to why it's included. All right, so maybe I should have paid a little more close attention to trying to hang on to some of this paper material that I encountered on the way down. We could have recycled some of it as bedding in our feeding here today. And you can see I've made quite a large opening. I'm going to put some fresh bedding in here. Even though we saw some leftovers of it from the previous feeding, we're just going to go ahead and give them a bit more. Because in a bin that's this age, still 45 days of age, being a pretty young bin still, kind of makes sense to provide a good, generous amount of bedding for the worms to make themselves at home in, to complement the food that they're receiving. As I get closer and closer to the point where I would want to try to harvest the material out of the bin, I'll start using less and less of that sort of stuff. And maybe just feed so that the food that I'm adding will all get depleted 1, 2, 3, but I wouldn't be left with all kinds of bedding scattered throughout the material, which would normally lend itself to an easier harvest of the material. I'm going to drop in the remainder of what we have here. It's a pretty generous portion. It appears to be even more than the last system got. Seems to be the theme lately. The last bin seemed like it could have probably used more food than this system. But this system received more food than the other one did. A little backwards. But it all comes out in the end. Doesn't seem to matter so much. I guess in my mind, in hindsight, it sometimes seems like I'm trying to, dispense the portions of food equally, or at least in common proportions to the amount of worms I'm observing in the systems. But you can't always get it right. You never know. I guess this being a newer system, I don't feel so bad using a bit more grit either. The pulverized eggshell is what I use as grit in my systems. Because to me it seems like newer systems could probably use it more than an older system. An older system has received numerous applications of grit, making me believe that there's probably a fair bit of the material floating around within the bin for the worms to use. But in a fairly new system like this one, I want to just make sure that there's adequate grit so that the worms have it when they need it without having to go crazy looking for it. All right, so I'm going to get things covered back up here nicely. kind of fluff things up a little too, maybe help it air out a bit, maybe dry off a bit. Although it's not going to dry much, you know, with the plastic covering being on here. And with it, you know, with it reaching pretty much edge to edge throughout the entire bin, there's not a lot of opportunity in these kinds of systems for moisture to be lost through evaporation. So I think we're going to probably expect to see a similar amount of moisture in here as we see now next time we check in here. Maybe that dry paper that we placed into the bottom as bedding will absorb a little bit of it, but you got to remember all those veggies that we placed in here, all that stuff is going to be emitting moisture as it thaws, as it gets consumed by the worms. So I don't think we're going to have a lot of opportunity for drying here, and that's fine. Like I said earlier, we'll have time to recover. Okay, not bad. Let's get these things back in place. Nice covering of newspaper. We only had one worm hanging out here on the top surface, but I got a feeling in the future we're going to see more worms coming out here to take advantage of the moisture that collects on this piece of paper from the recirculation, from the terrarium effect that's going on in here. So we're done. Well, almost done. I got a little bit of cleaning up to do around here and putting things away, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. I'm going to sign off now, but before I do, really quickly, let me just say thank you. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.